They pulled me over before the sun had fully figured out it was morning, two flashlights cutting across my dash like a bad movie, men in black vests, no badges, and a swagger that pretended to be authority. I remember thinking, weirdly casual, that if someone was going to impersonate law, they could at least learn how to act like it. Then one of them rapped his knuckles on my window, and everything turned very small and very loud. My name's Eli Turner, and I've lived on Willow Hollow Lane long enough to know the rhythm of our town. Who waves, who doesn't? And when trouble smells like fireworks, it's usually simple kids, parties, someone's temper. This was not simple. It started small, the way these things do. A notice slipped under my gate about truck compliance, a hand-scrawled citation left on my mailbox that looked official if you squinted and didn't read, a polite email from the Homeowners Association reminding people about community standards that read like a letter from someone who liked rules more than people. Margot Hale was the HOA president. Picture a woman who keeps her hair perfectly still in all weather, who smiles at subsidized charity events while plotting the next committee report, who had slowly turned the homeowners board into a little court of whispers. She'd been at odds with my neighbor for months over a shed, and the drama had bled into the neighborhood like oil on water. Nobody imagined Margot would drag her little kingdom into full-blown deception. The day I got pulled over, I'd been heading to the hardware store, nothing heroic, just a list and a plan, when the two men in vests blocked my path. "Evening," said the taller one, and his voice wanted to finish the sentence by telling me I'd already lost. He flicked through a clipboard like he owned the paper. "You're in violation," he said. "This vehicle is non-compliant with community transport codes." I blinked and told him I was on State Road 72 and had every right to be where I was, and that the man in the sunglasses tapped his chest and said, "We're the enforcement unit. Step out." It's funny what the brain does in these moments. I remember the grain of the steering wheel, the way coffee had stained the rim of my cup, the sudden clarity of everything that mattered. Kids at home, bills, the absurdity of two strangers with fake authority deciding my morning. I could have been polite and compliant, step out, show paperwork, get a citation, grumble, go on my way. That's how most people do it, and it's how you keep small escalations small. But there was a look in the eyes of the shorter man, Vince, like this was a game he'd rehearsed and enjoyed. He leaned in, and his voice dropped into that voice people use when they want to intimidate. "You step out now, or we escalate." It wasn't a threat dressed up as a suggestion. It was the real thing, all the blunt edges, and for a beat the world narrowed to the space between my chest and his words. I thought of Josie, my sister, who taught me not to trade principles for convenience. I thought of the old man down the street who'd once taught me to stand for what was right even when it cost you something small like comfort. So I stayed inside, and I kept my hands on the wheel. That's when Derek, the tall one, slammed his knuckles on the glass, hard enough to make the interior light flash, and something in me brightened into a terrible clarity. He reached for the door handle, and Vince shouted for compliance like they were conducting a theater exercise. Then Vince shrugged, almost theatrically, and there it was, the glint of metal, a hand on the back seat reaching for something large. I don't want to make a movie of fear here, nobody needs a how-to, but I can tell you exactly where my breath went and how my heart found a rhythm it hadn't used in years. Derek held up a saw, not pointed but very much implied, and said, "You don't want trouble." The words were meant to be the final card, the sort that demands surrender. People always ask later, after the cameras and the reposts and the commenters have moved on to the next outrage, what it felt like to be threatened. The truth is, it felt like a choice carved into two pieces. Either you give in and the thing that scares you keeps growing, or you call the bluff and risk whatever comes next. I chose the latter. I rolled down my window a crack and said, flatly, "Who put you in charge?" It was the kind of sentence that exposes a fake uniform for what it is, just cloth and attitude, and Vince's smile faltered. That's when the other neighbor, Mara, stepped out from the sidewalk where she'd been on her morning walk, phone in hand, because she didn't like the tone of strangers shouting at her neighbor. She yelled, "Those aren't real vests," like a witness blowing the whistle on the whole thing. The sound of Mara's voice felt like an incision, sharp, necessary. Derek's bluff scrambled for cover with words, and Vince tried to look official and failed. We all held our breath because Margot Hale had a reputation for being thorough, and what we didn't know was that Margot had pushed too far this time. A minute later, there were sirens, real, urgent, and a patrol car rolled up like a punctuation mark at the end of an ugly sentence. Sheriff Ramirez stepped out, old school, hand on his duty belt, not impressed with swagger, and said, clear as daylight, "You're impersonating law enforcement." That line landed with a kind of inevitability I hadn't expected, and for the first time since those men had wrapped the window, laughter leaked out of me, not from joy but from the sound of relief. What followed was small theater and big consequences. The men's vests were plain and their papers were faked. Derek tried a story about being a private compliance officer. Vince stammered about following orders from a committee, and Margot, who arrived in her SUV like a queen called to account, tried to look surprised at the scene her leadership had orchestrated. She had organized a quasi-enforcement apparatus, she said later in depositions, because the neighborhood had standards that needed protecting, because certain families didn't conform to the image she preferred, because a community is easier to control when rules are enforced by fear. That's the rot. It isn't always greed or malice. Sometimes it's the small, steady hunger for control, and it eats a place from the inside out. Neighbors came forward, quietly at first, then with more teeth. There were stories about bogus fines left in porches, late-night notices threatening towing for imagined infractions, a pattern of harassment designed to make certain people uncomfortable enough to leave. One elderly couple showed us a ticket that fined them for yard disposition because they preferred native plants over manicured lawns. Another family had been bullied for colors on their porch. The complaints painted a history of Margot's standards applied with a scalpel, and this time she'd used a saw literally to make a point, and it hadn't landed where she wanted. In court, there's always a moment that feels like a scene in a different genre, slow, legal, but strangely cinematic. The judge read the charges: impersonation, attempted coercion, organized harassment, and as the words filled the courtroom, you could feel the shape of the story settle into consequence. Derek and Vince pleaded guilty to several counts. Margot fought it for the publicity more than anything else, but the pattern, the notes, the witnesses, the recordings Mara had taken on her phone closed around her the way a door clicks shut. The HOA board was stripped of enforcement powers, fines were rescinded, and restitution was ordered. It didn't erase the months of small humiliations, the nights my neighbor lay awake thinking someone might come to their door with a badge that wasn't real, but it was accountability, which is not the same thing as justice, but it's a start. Afterwards, the neighborhood sat with a new kind of quiet. People walked a little taller, I think, because when your community sees you stand up, it changes what people imagine possible. We repaired fences, literally and figuratively. We hosted a street picnic where Margot was not invited, and where people brought dishes with names they were proud of. There were conversations, honest, messy ones about what a community should protect and who gets to decide. Some argued that rules keep chaos at bay, and they were right in small ways. Others said rules become walls when wielded by the wrong hands, and they were right too. The tension didn't vanish overnight, but the edges felt less sharp, and that was enough to keep people watching the board with a little more skepticism. If I learned anything from being threatened by two men with bad vests and a worse plan, it's that cowardice and courage are often less dramatic than we like to imagine. Courage is sometimes just answering a question. Who put you in charge? Courage is calling out a lie when everyone's pretending it's true. It's not heroic in the movies. Usually it's a neighbor stepping onto the sidewalk with their phone. It's a patrol car rounding the corner. It's a community saying, quietly, not today. We still argue about fences and colors and where boats can go and whose tree overhangs whose driveway. These are the small, human things that make a neighborhood, but we do it now with a memory of how thin the line is between order and coercion, how easily someone eager for control can dress up a uniform and try to take it for their own. So, if you've got an opinion, and I know you do, tell me. Where's the line between community standards and overreach? When does enforcement protect? And when does it turn into power dressed as virtue? Drop your thoughts below. Share a time your neighborhood surprised you, or tell me what you'd have done in my shoes. If nothing else, talk about the moment you first realized somebody you trusted could be wrong, because that conversation keeps us honest.